So first, let's break down the evolution of the pro-taxpayer Internal Revenue Code. Now, as a 40,000 degree view, the Internal Revenue Code is the domestic portion of the federal statutory tax law that governs all federal tax laws, including income tax. In reviewing the history of the code, a preliminary question into the taxability of illegal income is absolutely necessary. But in 1913, this issue would have never arisen because the Revenue Act of 1913 taxed income only from, quote, lawful businesses. Now, lawmakers criticized this approach, that is, to tax only legal businesses, because it limited the potential tax revenue the United States could collect. If we could collect also taxes from illegal businesses, the United States could generate more revenue. Now, back in the day, Senator John Sharp Williams, the senator who sponsored the Revenue Act of 1913, he rejected amendments that would have limited deductions for expenses only to those incurred in a legitimate or lawful trade or business. In the Senate debate, he stated, quote, "The object of our bill is to tax a man's income, not to reform man's moral characters. The law does not care where he got his income from, so far as the tax is concerned." Now, despite Senator Williams' best effort, the drafters of the 1913 tax code codified the limitation and taxed only lawful businesses. So Senator Williams was trying to expand the ability of the United States to collect taxes from illegal businesses, but the drafters of the code said, no, we're only going to tax lawful businesses. Now, fast forward 3 years to 1916, due to President Woodrow Wilson's call for revenue to support the United States' preparation for World War I, the drafters of the Internal Revenue Code adopted Senator Williams' approach 3 years earlier, that is, to tax income from any source, not just legal sources. Congress removed the word lawful from the code and started to tax income derived from, quote, any source whatever. Driven to raise revenue, the drafters were not concerned whether the person's tax came from a legal source, just that the taxpayer paid their taxes. Now, this revision indicates Congress's intent to treat individuals engaged in legal and illegal businesses equally in order to reflect the taxpayer's ability to pay. Now, in theory, under the 1916 code, the Internal Revenue Service, the IRS, would collect income tax from bank robbers or drug traffickers, even though these were illegal enterprises. Now, federal income tax applies only to net income, which is based on a fairly simple formula. So you'll start with gross income and subtract business expenses to calculate the net income. Then the business owner would pay taxes on that amount. Deductibility of business expenses is key, absolutely key to calculating net income. It's half of the equation, and it still serves a major role in today's income tax return forms. Now, from 1916 to the late 1940s, U.S. courts regularly allowed individuals engaged in illegal business to deduct business expenses, such as rent and salaries, so long as the expense themselves were ordinary and necessary under Section 162. Now, Section 162, this is the section that allows deductions for business expenses. Now, in answering what the basic requirements of ordinary and necessary were under Section 162, the Supreme Court imposed only the minimal requirement that the expense be, quote, appropriate and helpful for the development of the taxpayer's business. That comes out of a Supreme Court case called Welch v. Helvering from 1933. Now, the court said so long as the business expenses themselves were appropriate and helpful for the development of the taxpayer's business, the legality of the business itself played no role in deciding to allow the deduction. Now, if this was not the case, individuals who derived income from a legal business could avoid taxation merely by choosing to earn their living outside the bounds of the law. Now, the 1916 tax code was effective for two reasons. First, the notion that income from illegal businesses should be subject to taxation upheld the drafter's intent to tax income from any source whatever, as we mentioned that was the goal in 1916. Now, the United States successfully raised revenue under the 1916 code. The code increased receipts in the federal budget from $683 million in 1915 to over $3.6 billion in 1918. Now, the second reason why the 1916 tax code was effective was because the 1916 code served as a useful tool to deter illegal activity, such as tax evasion. But fear of other illegal activity, which in this case was opium and heroin abuse, that grew from World War I and into the 1950s. Uneasiness in allowing illegal enterprises to benefit from tax deductions started to worry the public. And as a result, when determining deductibility, courts started to consider the public's uneasiness alongside the drafters' goal to raise revenue. In 1947, the United States Tax Court adopted the public's concern when it disallowed expenses from bribes because bribes themselves were illegal and contrary to public policy. This comes out of a case Strala versus Commissioner out of the U.S. Tax Court in 1947. So here the courts felt pressured. The public was the public was uneasy that the United States was allowing illegal enterprises from benefiting from tax deductions, which kind of makes sense, to be honest. Now, continuing on in the late 40s, high-ranking U.S. officials also shared their disapproval of allowing illegal enterprises to deduct business expenses. At the 1953 American Bar Association's annual meeting, Attorney General Herbert Brownwell Jr. stated, and I quote, "I see nothing ordinary or necessary in expenses incurred in delivering dope, rent for houses used for gambling, or any other vice," close quote. So it soon became clear that allowing illegal enterprises to deduct business expenses was unpalatable to the courts and the American public. But the question, are business expenses that are not illegal per se, but are still contrary to public policy deductible, remained unanswered. In 1952, the Supreme Court first attempted to answer this question. In answering it in the affirmative, the Supreme Court developed what has come to be known as the, quote, public policy doctrine. Placing greater emphasis on the legality of the business expense itself, the court would disallow a business expense deduction if the expense frustrated policies evidenced by some governmental declaration of them. Here, this is a big case in the early 50s called Lilly versus Commissioner. And 6 years later, in 1958, the Supreme Court reformed its application of the public policy doctrine in another case called Commissioner v. Sullivan. The United States Supreme Court appeared skeptical of the public policy doctrine because it tried to satisfy the public's uneasiness, but continued to uphold the drafter's intent to tax income derived from, quote, remember, any source whatever, close quote. Now, in expanding the doctrine, the court disallowed a business expense deduction if the deduction itself was used to lessen the economic effect of a penalty imposed by the statute. Now, this holding expanded the list of ways the court could disallow business expense deductions under the doctrine. In limiting the doctrine, the court disallowed a business expense deduction only if the deduction contravened a federal policy expressed in a statute or regulation, rather than policies, evidenced by some governmental declaration of them, as the court laid out 6 years earlier in 1952. So, for example, the court allowed the deductions of rent and wages to conduct an illegal gambling business because paying rent and payroll did not violate an express federal policy through statute or regulation. In this case, the court forewarned us that disallowing tax deductions to illegal businesses would result in discrimination not provided for in the code. Fast forward into 1966, the Supreme Court again narrowed the application of the public policy doctrine when it held there are no violations of an express federal policy. Only in extremely limited circumstances may the court disallow deductions for business expenses. This is another monumental tax case called Commissioner v. Taxpayer in 1966. Now, in defining extremely limited circumstances, the deduction had to frustrate sharply defined national or state policies, and the allowance of such deduction must be severe and immediate. That's what the court said. In this case, here we dealt with a taxpayer who deducted attorney's fees as a business expense for his securities fraud business. The commissioner of the IRS argued that allowing the taxpayer to deduct the attorney's fees as expenses, even though the expenses themselves, the attorney's fees, were legal, that violated public policy because the IRS would be benefiting an illegal enterprise. Now, writing for the Supreme Court, Justice Stewart held the taxpayer's legal expenses were deductible because the expenses satisfied the meaning of ordinary and necessary under Section 162. Also, nor did any exceptional circumstance to enforce the public policy doctrine exist. This holding in this case suggests that per se, a legal business's expenses are not automatically disallowed because an expense could frustrate sharply defined policies yet not be severe and immediate. The public policy doctrine resulted in an inconsistent treatment of business owners, I think, because an illegal business owner could be taxed on a gross receipts basis, while another illegal business owner could be taxed on a net income basis, depending on what the court decided. Now remember, at this time, the public is uneasy about allowing certain illegal businesses to deduct business expenses, and as a result, their business is benefiting. Now, the Supreme Court's solution to ease the public uneasiness, but also uphold the drafter's intent to raise revenue, this is the public policy doctrine, gave too much discretion to the court and resulted in an unclear rule. So, Congress decided to take it into their own hands. They codified the narrow treatment of the public policy doctrine into the 1969 tax code. Now, the 1969 code still allowed for deductions for legal expenses made in relation to an illegal business, but Section 162 under the 1969 code now disallowed deductions on the basis of public policy for illegal business expenses such as bribes or kickbacks, or other illegal payment under any law. Now, this codification of the code satisfied Congress's intent to limit the public policy doctrine, as the Supreme Court has been encouraging since 1958. This codification set a clear rule. It promoted public safety and upheld the drafter's intent to raise revenue, which is the main responsibility of the IRS. Now, this codification of Section 162 hinged deductibility on the legality of business expense, not the legality of the business itself. This more nuanced approach did not survive Congress's codification of the 1982 tax code. With public concern of illicit drug use rising and President Nixon's declaration of the war on drugs in the 1970s, the 1982 tax code turned the reading of Section 162 upside on its head. The revision of the 1982 tax code refocused Section 162 to turn on the legality of the business rather than the legality of the business expense.